The classification number indicates the general class of goods and or services that your mark is used to sell under. Now, when you file your application, you have to indicate what the classification number is for the good and service that you're applying under. When the trademark examiner does their search, they take the classification number into consideration. So when examiners are doing their search, looking for likely confusing marks, they will often look for similar marks in the classes that you apply for. So it's important that you get the classes correct, because one name that might be really, really strong in one class may not be so strong in another class. So that's why it's important. It's a good strategy to try to identify classes that you might be able to apply under that might increase your chances of getting your mark registered. Now, also as a technical point, it's also important to get the classification correct, and the examiner will actually propose, in a lot of cases, they will actually propose amendments. If you get the classification number incorrect, they will often propose correct classifications that they believe your mark should be registered under. So that's good in the sense that even if you accidentally do not submit the application under the correct classification, you'll have an opportunity later to amend the identification of services or goods. Now, there's one caveat to that I really want to point out and make sure that it's clearly communicated to all of you. When you submit your initial application, I always encourage people to go broader rather than narrower. So you actually have to describe the nature of the goods and services that you are providing. Later, during the application process, you can't broaden the description of the goods. You can only narrow them. And often, in our practice, what we see more often than not is examiners will often introduce their own amendments based on the services and goods that you're providing, further typically narrowing the scope of the description of goods and services in your initial application. How do you actually go about identifying what the goods and services are? So fortunately, the Trademark Office has a very, very good description for goods and services on their website. And I just want to show you guys this. This is a very, very useful page. Now, at the very top, it gives you some of the background that there's goods and there's services. And so it has some nice general remarks on the two general types of categories that a brand can protect, goods and services. But then the nice thing is that as you go through it, the classes actually have a short description of what that class identification number is covering. Now, I'm going to just talk about three really, really common ones. You can see there's many classes, but I want to cover some really popular ones. So one is Class 9. Class 9 is where you're going to find your downloadable software, like apps. So downloadable apps, your logo for your app, your icon for your app, the name of your app, this is going to be under Class 9. Let's keep going down. Another really popular one that we see often in our practice is Class 25. And Class 25 covers clothing. So this is going to be hats, t-shirts, pants, you name it. So it has a nice list that explains each one has a nice explanation, and it gives you examples. What's nice is it also gives you examples of things that are not included. For example, certain types of clothing it indicates would not be covered under Class 25, like special type of footwear, for example, or protective gear that would not be under Class 25. Now, one thing that I want to point out here is that often people will file under broad clothing and apparel, or just clothing in general. While that's okay, it is okay to start out broad. Just know that you are very, very likely going to get an examiner that's going to request that you further clarify or amend the description of goods and services. So that's probably going to be something like the examiner saying, please narrow the description to something like clothing and apparel, namely, and then a list. You're going to have to provide a list of all the types of clothing that you provide under your mark. Now, the other common class that I just want to point out, well, there's actually two more that I thought would be useful. for the audience here. One is 41. 41 is for educational or entertainment content. So if you create a YouTube channel, for example, or for example, any type of content, either for sports related, gaming, education, that content, you can protect the brand that provides that content under class 41. Oh, and by the way, for you streamers out there, if you're streaming under your brand, 38 is the way to go. So you're going to be using class 38 for streaming services. Now, there's one more class that I want to point out, and that's 42. Okay, 42 is going to be for your non-downloadable SaaS product. Okay, so this is also a very, very common mark in today's industry. So I just want to give you guys a quick pointer. Okay, this is a pro tip. If you have, for example, a mobile app that you also have a web component, a desktop component where you can actually access the service without downloading something onto your computer and can actually just access it from a browser, then please note, you might want to consider filing under both class 9 and 42. So class 9 would cover the downloadable aspect of what you're offering. Now class 42, that classification will cover the desktop version or the web-based version where the user can access the service on a web page without having to download any sort of application. But there's also other strategies that you can use when trying to figure out what classification you fall under. So that's actually called the Trademark ID Manual, and we're going to cover that in next week's episode.